Okay, great. Well, welcome everyone. Very glad you could join us today. I'm just trying to present my slides. Okay. So welcome to the 10th annual monthly seminar in the 2022 STIR seminar series. Very pleased that you could join us and very pleased to acknowledge our partners at ASU East and Maastricht, and also our co-hosts and co-organizers, who are many and spread across the globe. Wanted to start with just a quick reminder of what STIR is. It's a platform for reflexivity and responsiveness investigation, and it's a co-investigation. So unlike interviews that extract information from the field, STIR has a protocol that collaboratively maps and describes decision spaces and does this over time in order to understand expert capacities to be more reflexive and responsive to social considerations and concerns, and also to explore to what extent these capacities can be more robustly exercised. And finally, interestingly enough, doing this as a research endeavor tends to exercise and enhance those very capacities. So STIR also is a capacity builder, but we build and engage with these capacities carefully so as to maintain the research focus and to allow the capacities to develop as much as possible on their own without our intentional influence to try to direct them. So let's see if we can move to the next slide. I think I went over a couple of them. Here we go. So we've had a number of speakers so far in the seminar series, as you can see, and it's actually a good time to note that Marika Smolka has led and I should say Dr. Marika Smolka has led a wonderful midpoint review of this STIR seminar series that looks at the first 6 or so presentations and some of the themes that came up and discussions and debates. And this was published in the East newsletter. So we're putting that link in the chat right now. And there'll be another sort of final assessment or review that comes at the end. But STIR studies have been conducted around the globe since, oh boy, over 10 years. And a number of these have been published, and a number of those who have published these papers or conducted seminal studies are part of this first year seminar series, including our good friend, Paul Ellwood, Dr. Paul Ellwood, who is a senior lecturer at the University of Liverpool in the management department. And Paul conducted one of the first STIR studies, and it was seminal in a number of ways, one of which being his background as a management scholar and professor, but also the particular labs that he was embedded in. And he's going to focus on one of the 2 labs in the UK and look at a particular modulation that developed over time and show us a little bit about not just what happened, but also some of the conditions that may have led to that, both methodologically, socially, and otherwise. And he's also going to give us a glimpse of how to interpret that modulation through the lens of an influential theoretical paper that he co-published in Research Policy. So wonderful, Paul, to have you back in the fold. Really looking forward to your insights and guidance and discussion. And I will turn the floor over to you.
Okay, thank you, Eric. Let me have a go at sharing my screen. There we are. How does that look? Is that my my slides
Great.
up there for everyone?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, thank you, Eric, for that introduction, and thank you for the invitation to think back on our collaboration together. It's over 10 years ago now. So what I'm going to do in this slide is report some findings that we haven't published yet. From one of the particular studies, and one particular incident or decision point in one of the studies that and this is something we haven't published yet. That's in the first half of these slides, and then the second half, I'd like to, by way of opening the discussion, relate it to something we have published in the research policy paper, as Eric said, a bit more theoretical in nature. So let's get into this. I'll start by introducing myself just with a few photographs. So on the left, we have some photographs that remind me of that STIR study. It was actually back in January 2009. It seems like a different age now. I can recall when leaving the workshop, flying out to Phoenix, listening to Mr. Obama's first inauguration speech in the cafe in the airport. So that does seem like another age ago. But here are some happy memories for me. One is watching the Phoenix Suns beat the Atlanta Braves, which was my one and only basketball game in the States. My supervisor, who was with me at the time, was a big basketball fan. He insisted, and some of his favorite players were on the court that day, and he insisted going to watch. And also we have the cake, which Eric said he's forgotten about. The cake, which I think somebody cooked for us. So when the workshop had finished, just by way of celebration, we all had a slice of cake and a drink of orange juice. So that was nice. And then a photograph of some of that first cohort of starers, some of whom I think are presenting in this series. So I can see Shannon there, and Eric, Mikhail, who I think is connected with the series, Dan has presented, and next month I think you've got Francois on the right there in the yellow t-shirt presenting. So some happy memories. Also on the right hand side of the slide, I have just a few prompts to introduce myself. I think a few images that introduce myself, and some things that are going to resonate through the slides. So the first point I wanted to make is my first education was in the natural sciences, and my first PhD was actually in chemistry. And the figure 3 at the top right there is taken from my chemistry thesis. And broadly, it was in an area of chemistry that today might be called labeled nanotechnology. That wasn't a phrase in particular use in the 1980s. And we're going to hear a bit of nanotechnology today. The photograph of the Persil washing powder is to remind me that my working life then took me into industry, where I was a research scientist and business director for a while. And one of the areas of one of the product areas that I worked with was washing powder and the ingredients that go into washing powder. But I didn't stay in well, I stayed in industry actually about 17 years, so I suppose it was quite a while. But after a few twists and turns, I ended up in a university business school researching innovation. But I found that the subject that I've always been drawn to is actually born of maybe this early education. So I like to study how we organize to do science in universities, and particular research groups that have a wider set of interests than just a purely academic. And so we have a photograph here of a BBC story allied to a medical technology research centre I was connected with, who were interested in this sort of grand societal challenge of aging populations, and they'd got this vision to stop the aging clock at 50, which was quite engaging. So a kind of very varied sort of intellectual background, I like to think, but to express it a little bit more mundanely, let's go on to the next slide. Here are some words that express my current research interests. So I'm interested in innovation management, how we organize to do innovation, and particularly at and across boundaries. And listed there with some of the bullets are some of the types of boundaries that I've explored in my research: institutional, national, and the boundary between humans and non-humans currently. The photograph at the side from Nature journal the other year, the people behind that photograph and that science are a group I'm working with now, trying to create an autonomous artificial intelligent chemist. And it's something we can come back to. I suppose theoretically, I'm interested in processual accounts of innovation, but I'm also interested in my research and in my teaching, in fact, in the relationship between reflexivity and action. So here's a straightforward list, but in writing it down, the thing that struck me as I reflected on that was, in a sense, the enduring influence of STIR, because STIR was concerned with was a multidisciplinary engagement. It was, it was concerned with different sorts of boundaries. The midstream modulation exercise is inherently processual in nature, and we were interested in building capacity for reflexivity with the people we worked with and in ourselves. So while in one sense I've left the topic, the subject matter of responsible innovation, there's something about STIR that still got its grips in me and is still holding my my interest. Okay, so what I'd like to do getting into this then, I'd like to look in regards to the STIR study that I was part of, one particular decision point in some interest, and look at the build-up to that the decision point. And so these next few slides are just some items of context to the particular engagement study. So first of all, the lab context. So this was the first study I did. This was a number of months just after that opening workshop in Tempe in January 2009. And the lab context there was a conventional chemical engineering research group. It was led by a single professor. The group was of a modest size. It had 8 PhDs and 3 postdocs. They had a kind of well-established and conventional growth. If I want to try to describe them in one particular label, using, for example, the Stokes, I've used the Stokes typology there. They were interested in what we might call what Stokes calls use-inspired basic research. So they did basic research, but they liked working with industrial partners. They had long-standing partnerships with industry, and in fact the professor had actually spun out 2 startup companies from his research. So they were interested in what went on in the outside world, as it were. They liked working with industry, the scientists told me, because they got interesting materials to work with rather than having to work with model systems. And the diagram on the left is just to remind me that the particular area of nanotechnology that they were interested in is allied to what they would call colloidal science. And this interest in colloidal science had allowed them to partner with the industrial company that's going to be the subject of the first part of this talk. So that's the lab context. A little bit about the policy context at the time. So in 2009, one of the big areas of discourse in UK universities was something that was labelled then, still labelled now actually, the research impact agenda. So university departments every 6 or 7 years get evaluated for quality. And at that time in 2009, a new category of criteria for the evaluation was emerging, and this was labelled research impact. And in this, research groups, research departments, universities had to give account of the impact of their work beyond the academy. So they'd always been evaluated in terms of a kind of peer review and their standing within their own discipline, but now they had to give accounts of their impact beyond the academy. And at the time of the engagement, what this meant, both conceptually and for the evaluation exercise that was destined for 2014, it was a matter of discussion. It followed the origins of this particular policy came out of the UK government's innovation policy over a decade, and there was a rhetoric around the role of universities and the contribution of universities to the knowledge economy. But the research councils were trying to embed this research impact and the possibilities and the prospects of research impact into their decisions on funding, for example. And it was coming together under something that was known as the Research Excellence Framework, which we still have with us now, 10 years later. So allied to that, at the same time, the main funder of social research in the and physical research in the UK was conducting an exercise in responsible innovation. So this was assisted by Richard Owen. I think many of you will know Richard was a professor, I think, at University College London and also at Exeter University. And he was helping them make sense of this thing called responsible innovation. And they were doing it in a kind of action research mode. So allied to a geoengineering research call, research groups responding to that call had to give an account of how their perspective, their project, their research proposal met the criteria of responsible innovation. What the criteria were was kind of a bit open for debate. That was what Richard was coordinating in a sense. Out of all that work came the research responsible innovation framework that he published in Research Policy around about the same time as our own paper, came out of this work to a degree. So responsible innovation was also part of the discourse at the time. And then we would get individual significant calls like the one mentioned at the bottom here from the government's Technology Strategy Board for the responsible development of nanoscale technologies. So in summary, there is a discourse going on about responsible innovation. There is a discourse going on about research impact, but it's at a very nascent form. So it's been presented as, what do these things mean conceptually? What do these things mean to how we practice science? This was the policy context for the study. Okay, so here's me. I go into the research group, this research group, which I'm calling COLCO. And I'm introducing myself as we do at the start of a study. I'm trying to get to know them, trying to explain some of my interests and concerns. And we start talking about this thing called responsible innovation. And here are some quotes that I think are quite typical of the initial responses that people have got in many STIR studies. So look, the first one, I'll just read these out. So this was, I think, from the professor himself. Ethical issues in terms of the public is not so much present to us. There are basic things, such as we wouldn't try to use carcinogenic substances to prepare capsules, which would eventually be injected into humans. So in this quote, we hear that typical sort of response that, you know, socio-ethical concerns, what concerns? You know, we don't work with hazardous materials. So if they did think about ethics at all, it's in terms of health and safety, and largely the health and safety of the scientists working in the lab, quite frankly, rather than people outside. Because, as we read in the second quote, I assume this is something, and a specific funding call was referred to, that the public wants, and it's complicated, really. So it was somebody else's responsibility. It was the owner of the funding call to kind of specify what was at issue here. However, more positively, in a sense, and showing the open-mindedness of the group and possibly why they'd invited me here, we read at the bottom, I think there are ways of integrating them, that is to say, social and ethical concerns, but it depends on specifically what they are. We need more opportunities like this, it's referring to the STIR study, so we can discuss this sort of thing, as the main problem is a lack of interaction. So all that sounded positively. So the baseline position is we don't think there's any issues here, but we're open to having a conversation. So it's a good way to go forward. So as part of the study, as one part of the study, my engagement with them explored this collaborative innovation project that they were a part of. And it's this particular collaborative innovation project that I'm going to want to focus on this morning. So what I've got in the slide here is a kind of a schematic of the partners in this collaborative innovation project. It was led by a transnational corporation that I'm calling Home Care Company, expressed in the yellow box in the center here. And the aim of their project was to improve the cleaning power of an existing dishwater tablet. So they're a well-known producer of dishwater tablets, and they'd got a new formulation that they thought would have some advantage in the marketplace by virtue of enhanced cleaning power. And the purpose of this academic project, which was allied to a project within their own company, was to understand the mechanism of cleaning. So Colco, who are represented here in the light blue box, their goal in the collaborative project was to elucidate the cleaning mechanism of this nanoparticle that they'd added to the dishwater tablet. Second partner I've called Computer Modeling Group. These people were doing kind of modeling studies of the layering of the nanoparticles on surfaces, and particularly surfaces, ceramic surfaces, and that we'd find in plates and metal surfaces in cutlery. And it just so happened coincidentally that the computer modeling group was in the same university department as Colco, the research group that I was embedded in. And then there was a fourth partner in this project that I'm calling Toxicology Group. And these are people who were just studying the toxicological effects of the ingredients in the dishwater tablet. Now, what I try to express in this diagram is a very strict division of scientific labour, as it were. Home Care Company in the centre controlled everything. They were the project managers. They had strict routines about project management. They met monthly to get updates. Out of those project management meetings, actions came, and each of the three groups went off on their own and did their actions and reported back. Home Care Company, for their part, did sort of real-world experimentations. They used dishwashers, and they did certain very practical tests on dishwashers, but they kept that to themselves. The other things I wanted to say, just by way of context, is this is not the first collaborative project with Colco. They had worked with Home Care Company over a number of years, and they had a good relationship, and they thought they had a high degree of mutual trust. So this is the project that I would like to talk about. And next bit of context is I would like to introduce you to Bob. Bob is the researcher with whom I was working in this project. He was a postdoc who was leading the Colco research in this collaborative project. Now, he was a physicist in this chemical engineering research group. And I wanted, by way of introducing Bob and the sort of scientist he was, to share with you this quote from him. Because this kind of really nicely captures the sort of scientist he was, I think. So he said to me in one of our introductory conversations, "I must admit that from my physical type of background, I quite like mechanical property ideas. Since I have been in the group, so in Colco, I've been addressing more physical chemistry problems. And the idea here is mostly based around the control of absorption of the nanoparticles onto cutlery and the understanding of it. My side of it has been largely, can we understand what these instruments deliver? And it's the instruments to study this absorption. Here's the important point I want to make, which is slightly different take on what many of the other guys in Colco do. They use instruments to generate data on their samples. And the assumption is that if they see a certain response from the instrument, that means something. And I've emphasized the word means because he emphasized it in his tone of voice when he spoke to me. So this guy's a basic scientist. If the rest of the group are interested in use-inspired basic science, he's not. He's interested in basic science. And even, and I've included at the bottom a kind of good-natured quote from one of the other postdocs who said of Bob, he's a real scientist. So this is a kind of a good-natured poking fun sort of thing. They're not reals. Compared with Bob, he was like the scientific conscience of the group. Whenever they were making claims, he was the one that would rein them back in to the physical science. So this is the type of guy who's in this industrial collaboration project. And it didn't sit comfortably with him. So some more quotes to follow from Bob. This working with people who wanted to do practical stuff, it didn't sit comfortably. And here's some reasons why. He said to me, we are naturally curious and we say, well, this has come our way. That's not what I expected. Why is that? Let's investigate. It doesn't matter if I don't get as many industrial type data answers to their problems as I did in the previous months, because maybe the intention is for publication. So he found it difficult working with industry and having to kind of deliver. He did deliver on what his actions were, but it wasn't his natural, it wasn't natural to him. He just wanted to do basic physics, really, but it came down to it. What you find, he says in the second quote, is that presenting those results to industry is very difficult because they need to have something that they can understand and that is fairly clear message. Either, yes, it works, no, it doesn't work. Yes, we see something, no, we don't see something. That type of thing is what we're looking for. And very often science, as you know, is different shades of grey. So this is part of my introduction to Bob. He's not a natural collaborator with industry. He has an indifference or even at times an antipathy towards industrial research. Okay, let's get into some final bits of context. Where we are, where this project is, when I go in to do the mid-mod exercises, this is a 3-year project and it's at the end, it's just entering the third year. They have already very defined project management routines. Now, at the time of my 12-week study, Bob had a sense that home care were going to terminate the project. Their project meetings had become considerably more frequent. They were almost every week at some times rather than every month. And actually, the project was, he was right, the project was terminated near the end of my 12-week engagement, and it was terminated because it was felt it didn't have commercial potential. And I actually completed a few more interviews with him after the 12-week study because I wanted to know what happened, and it's that I'm going to talk about. So I'm going to set up this decision point and then include some conversations that we had after my 12-week study. Okay, I think this might be the final bit of context, then we can get into it. Here is the venue for the mid-mod exercises. So this is a part of Bob's lab. In the center there, we have an atomic force microscopy instrument, and what he was doing was studying the deposition of nanoparticles onto surfaces. This was part of understanding the cleaning mechanism. So I would often sit in that brown chair you can see to the right, and he would be sat in front of the instrument, and we would go through the mid-mod protocol. Depending on what he was doing, this might last an hour. The longest lasted 2.5, 3 hours. I think they were often, if he was doing something and he had to concentrate, the conversation might stop for 5 minutes and I'd sit there in silence while he would do some things with these instruments that we can see, and then we would resume again. So we were having these conversations while he was doing the science largely. It wasn't over coffee, he wasn't reminiscing, and he was often using the experiment that he was working on as a kind of prompt to say things to me. Okay, so what we have in the next slide, this is just a summary of all the data I collected over the, it must have been 14 weeks in the end, with Bob, just summarized in terms of those 4 familiar categories of opportunity, consideration, alternatives, and outcomes. So there's a whole bunch of stuff here, which is a summary of many threads of conversation that occurred over that time. What I'd like to pick up is just a couple of threads of conversation that lead to a particularly interesting decision point. So the first, so here is just expressed in the, a size of font that you can read. Here are the threads of opportunities that weaved through the 14 weeks. And I'm going to look at the first one in the first instance in particular. So this was a thread of conversation in which we were looking at how his emerging understanding of the cleaning mechanism that these nanoparticles were enabling informed the parallel work of the toxicology project performed by ToxicRes. Okay, that was the other group that he had no direct contact with. So he was learning things about what these nanoparticles were doing. What were the implications of that for the toxicology study? That was one thread of conversation that weaved through the 14 weeks. And here are some of the considerations that it elicited, that came out of that. One was this, what seemed to me this problematical division of labour that saw Bob having to report to the centre, and he couldn't speak directly. There was no direct channel of communication between his research group and the toxicology research group. He had his own schedule of work to talk about, and he delivered on that. Despite his antipathy and his indifference to industrial research, he delivered on what he had to do for the monthly meeting. Now, a lot of the work at this time was what was called on the wet cycle stage. So this was that part of the wash cycle when water's present and the cleaning is happening. So virtually all these experiments were done with water being present. We talked about toxicity and the difference between the toxicity of a chemical and the toxicity of its nano variant, which he was studying. And we also talked about he was interested in the cleaning mechanism, but also the potential relationship to the toxicology mechanism. That was another aspect. And the complication caused by the other ingredients being in the dishwater tablet formulation. You know, there was toxicological implications of the other stuff, not just the nanoparticles. But the point I want to emphasize out of all these considerations that was evident in many conversations is one of the things in the middle. He had lots of ideas for wet cycle research projects because we were sat at the site of him doing the research. Something would happen and he would say, oh, well, he would say, for example, what we've got, I think, on the next slide. So here's a quote. If they say our primary goal with the project is to try to understand the mechanism of absorption of nanoparticle on different surfaces and the mechanism of removal, that's already 2 major questions. So we can start to look at those processes, and that what he was doing. And we will probably find that it's a 3-year study. To then say, okay, does it lay? That would be a follow-up project. So interspersed in the conversation was always this, oh, that could be another project I would be interested in doing in that. Lots of ideas for things he'd like to do, if only he was allowed to do. But he had these strict project management goals. He had these strict actions, experiments to perform for the next monthly meeting. So what actually happened, if we look at the alternatives and the outcomes part of the data, this is expressed in this. So there were lots of things he could do that we talked about through those conversations. He could contact toxic group directly with some of these ideas that we were talking about. He could even raise the issues in the context of the monthly review meeting. He could try to read some of the toxicology group's research papers and what they were working on. He could do some of his own curiosity-driven experimentation, or he could just continue to work on the to the project meeting deadlines and the actions set by the industrial partner. These were all things we kept coming back to as part of the conversation. What did he actually do? He continued to just do the work he was set at the project meetings. So we were talking about lots of possibilities, lots of different courses of action. But what he did was, he did what a good project partner ought to do. And this speaks to, I think, this is important for what's coming later, I think. This speaks to these really strongly institutionalized norms of collaboration between university and industry. The university, in these sorts of particular projects, the university contribution was prescribed. They got the opportunity to work on interesting materials, they got the freedom to publish, but the things they had to do were very tightly defined in these projects. These really strong institutionalized forces of how we behave in projects. Okay, let me pick up a second thread of a conversation, or the opportunities category. And this is what's number 4 at the bottom here, in which another thread, another sort of line of conversation we had was whether societal issues related to dishwater products could only be raised by the industrial partner, or could Bob himself or one of the other partners at that monthly meeting, could they say, no, I've read something about water usage and dishwater tablets in the press, and could that be raised in those monthly meetings? So as part of this thread of conversation, here are some of the considerations that would be raised. Well, Bob certainly felt that if there was an issue with, because this transnational corporation, I can't mention the name, but they're very well known. You do know them. You do probably use their products. If there was any issue, it would be in the news and you would hear about them. But it wasn't a topic of conversation at the meetings. The meetings were very instrumental, allied to the project action set. Now Bob was actually he celebrated his 40th birthday while I was with him. He'd been a postdoc since for about 16 years in various different groups. So he's immensely experienced scientist, far more experienced postdoc than we often encounter. And his experience with in other projects and other universities is that the partners have hidden agendas, they keep stuff to themselves. He was mindful of that. And he realized that the partner might want a degree of secrecy because its main competitor was also working in this university, and he might pass on the information inadvertently. So he did understand that. Even though formal confidentiality agreements that we spoke about are something of the norm, information can get passed on inadvertently. So here are different dimensions to the conversation that we're having about raising societal interests. So what about the alternatives and outcomes? What did we encounter? None. This was just a conversation between me and Bob of possibilities. He could not see any alternative, any courses of action. In contrast with the other situation where we were looking at the relationship with the toxicology study, where he could at least envisage actions that he could. It wasn't in his mindset almost to identify any questioning of that wide that was drawn from a kind of a wider society of interests. So again, it speaks to this really strongly institutionalized norms of knowing your place almost in this collaboration. Okay, so these are the antecedents. This is 12 weeks of the study here. These are the kind of the antecedents of what I'm now going to build up to. Because what happened then is the industrial partner stopped its interest in the project. And this was for purely commercial reasons. The performance of the product in real world tests was not sufficiently enhanced that they felt they could make a difference in the marketplace and get more market share and more profit. So it just stopped. 9-month funding remained in the project. Bob was funded and a PhD student was funded. And so the industrial partner just said, over to you. You can do what you want. Let us know, if you find anything you think we'll be interested in. Monthly meetings stop. No need to, the final report was written at this point. You can do what you want. So what does he do? What does he do? We've been talking for 12 weeks about all the things he could do. If only he was free, if only he didn't have institutionalized discipline of the monthly meeting to report to. What could he do? And he had, I didn't count them, but almost every time we sat down, he thought of an interesting series of experiments that he could do to look at this mechanism in the wet cycle. What does he do? So I'm going to put the quote of the actual conversation when I asked him this, what are you doing? I went back in week 13 and said, what are you doing? I've got to tell you, even 12 years later, reading what he said, what you're going to read on the next slide, when I put these slides together for this talk, it still amazed me what he said. I was still taken aback about what his decision was, because he had all that choice. Here's what he did. So what have you been doing, Bob, asks I. Bob, I've been doing some drying work recently. A newish area since I spoke to you last. He goes on, this is closer to the area in which the toxicology people will be involved in. That's to say, human contact with things that are on objects already. So by this time, so alarm bells are going off in my head because I can't quite believe this. I'm starting to look at systems where I have deliberately dried particles down onto the surface. And so because I'm drying them means they've nowhere else to go. Deposition is very different to what we have been doing previously. That side of things is still being investigated. So what he means by that is the PhD student is getting on with all these other ideas that he's had. The wet side is still being studied. The PhD student is doing that. But he's doing something, the wet side will still have scientific interest. The dried point of view is aiming more towards the structures that are found and possibly, I'm guessing here, he says, may have some impact from a toxicological point of view. In other words, the ease with which they can be transferred into the human body and what concentrations are relevant. So if I find a surface that is very patchily covered with particles on a particular concentration, that would be of relevance for the toxicologist, as you can imagine. So I thought, wow, at this point, why has he done that? So what's behind this change in direction, asks I. It's my idea, really, he says. It's my idea, really. Not sure where it's come from. That's my idea, really. I thought that based on all the work we've done, both here and the bits and pieces that we've learned from the home care company, it's quite clear that except under a very few circumstances, do you get absorption directly in the liquid state of these nanoparticles onto any particular surface. That being the case, and also knowing that home care have reported many times to us that we know particles are going down, then the obvious way that that can take place is through drying. So in 2 years and 3 months of the project, he studied and been happy to study and go along with studying the wet cycle. And then he suddenly, that continues, the PhD students doing that, but he's decided to do this. And what he finds is that the nanoparticles do indeed build up on the dry plate. And he did report that to the, he didn't keep that to himself. He did report that to the industrial company. And I can presume, I don't know, I assume it was followed up. It had no real world impact. So here is a decision point that it seems to me that is certainly in the context of this project really quite, it was quite unique because he was free to decide what he could do. And the interesting question for me in the context of the STIR study is, to what extent, to any degree, did the midstream modulation exercises in some way inform this decision? Did he build it? We'd had these 12 weeks of these kind of reflective conversations, these ongoing threads where we're going back, trying to understand what does this mean? And we're building up this big picture that we saw of the table of opportunities, considerations, and alternatives. And when he gets the option, he does something that he, the basic scientist with no interest in industrial research and no interest and knowledge of a wider societal concerns, does something that has industrial relevance and wider societal concerns. So that is kind of interesting, I think. So with that ends the kind of first part of the talk. And if I sound a bit animated, it's because I was. It's because I was at this point. Now, Eric, I don't know whether you want me to pause now before going into the second theoretical bit, whether there's any questions I could take at this point, or whether I should plow straight on.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea, Paul. People might have a few questions. We do want to get to the theoretical because that's important work, and there's also a tie-in to the study. But people might be interested for a number of reasons, methodologically, content-wise. So let's just pause and see if there are any comments, questions, feedback.
Yeah. I'll stop sharing there briefly.
I'll just say, well, there may not be any, but I'll just say that it's interesting, for those who are, watching now or who are watching the recording, the STIR program has gone through various stages. And so, Paul's work is before we sort of develop the midstream modulation framework in a more nuanced manner to look specifically at what we're calling now modulation sequences, where there's a de facto baseline, a reflexive moment, and then a deliberate result. And you can see this implicit in Paul's overall structure, right? And so a lot of people maybe have been focusing that. And one of the things that Paul's done, and he's really showing the utility of it, is since a lot of STIR studies, sometimes you get these amazing modulation sequences that are obvious, you see them early, they have a lot of clear significance, but sometimes you spend 12 weeks and it's not clear if there is some modulation or not, right? And so what Paul's done that I think enables, a sort of closer analysis is to take the decision protocol, the 4 components of the decision protocol, which really is a data gathering exercise, and then to use it to organize these and to identify these different conversational threads. And then as he can sort of reconstruct these threads over time, right? Instead of, one protocol exercise where you have 3 alternatives, which one are you going to do? And then a couple of weeks later, oh, you did a different one. What happened there? This allows Paul to sort of uncover what was in the air, so to speak, the discursive environments, and then to see if there are changes over time. So it's a very nice illustration of that. But let me go to Marika, who's got a question or a comment.
Yeah, many thanks for this presentation. I mean, this is a really great storyline, and also how you build it up with the context. Super interesting. And I'm also very intrigued, or yeah, impressed, let's say, by Paul's decision to do something with industrial and societal relevance. And yeah, I think I'm curious how you managed to spend so much time with him. Just because often in steer studies, we're very constrained. Researchers are rushing. I mean, they have 1 hour max, or they're even if they want to spend more time with you, their PI says, no, you can't, or so. In your case, of course, I saw that you were one of the few people who actually did steer while the person was working, but even that is something that might not be allowed, right? Especially because people are so caught up in these structures that you mentioned many times. So I'm curious why you think this was possible. Do you think also this is maybe related to, let's say, Bob being already more senior, and you also having had quite some experience in different fields, rather than, you know, me as a PhD student having done this sort of work? So yeah, I'm curious how you interpret that, because I would say, but this is also just, you know, of course, an assumption that this really intense collaboration, so the hours you spend with him, the 3 hours, as you mentioned, sometimes, that this also really contributed a lot to the modulation that you observed. So yeah, thank you.
Yeah, so that's yeah, that is a good question. I mean, I think yes, there's something about us both being older than the average PhD student. I guess that we were similar ages at the time. Maybe I was a bit older than him at the time of the study. That might have helped. I think there was something in, because he was an older postdoc. He was sort of very well organized by nature, so he knew, and he was the senior postdoc as well, so he could decide. He knew when he was going to use that instrument. He had the first call on it, and so we could. I knew that if I turned up in the lab at such and such a time, because he said he was going on the instrument, then he probably would be. So there was some just contextual factors, but I did some of the things you've said about the STIR study. I recognize in my conversations with other scientists, and how it could be difficult to talk to them. Certainly while they were, for want of a better phrase, doing science. The particular science that Bob was doing involved us both sat down in front of an instrument. And as long as I was prepared to stay the time, he would be happy to talk. So there's another context, I think, around the particular science that he's doing. Some of the other guys that were more wet chemistry, where they might be moving around the lab, it wasn't, I was in the way. So we would meet over coffee, and they were sort of reflecting on, over coffee, as it were, whereas, they weren't doing science. So there is something about the context, I think, of us too, and the particular practice of science that he was engaged in, I think.
Yeah, great question. And I'll just say that I think Paul was one of a number of people who were physically and temporally embedded in the workflow, both in this first group. We had 20 STIR investigators in this initial STIR coordinated series of projects. And then since we've had multiple waves, but I think this is always an emphasis to try to get as close as you can. But of course, there are trade-offs. And I could tell a few stories that would be of interest, but I don't want to steal any more time from Paul, because I know he's got some theoretical slides, and then we want to discuss those. So unless there are other comments, let's go back.
Okay, let me share the screen again. There we go. Is that back on? Yeah. Okay, so in this second half, I'm doing something which I didn't do at the time, but I've done now with Eric's encouragement. So what we have here is a paper that myself and Christo Panja, who was my doctoral supervisor, published in Research Policy in 2013. And I want to look at the set of ideas that are in this paper and see if I can relate them to the story that I've just just told. So our wider set of interests as management and organisation scholars is in how, in this case, research groups organise in order to do innovation. And in this particular paper, we were interested in how responsible innovation becomes institutionalized, or how might, it would be more accurate to say, how might responsible innovation, this new discourse that was happening in the UK, become institutionalized in project practices. We'd seen in the other examples some other fairly straightforward project management routines, and the division around the division of labour are strongly institutionalized. So how do we institutionalize responsible innovation? So and our particular framing, our theoretical framing, was to look at the interplay between strategic and ethical agencies. And our starting point for this was that there's a paper by Ellwood and Misha entitled "What is Agency?" that I think is quite well known, and they write about projective agency, evaluative agency, and iterational agency, and we kind of translated those into the language of organisation studies, as it were. So projective agency, which is about future trajectories of action, the considerations involved in that, we would label strategic agency in an organisational context. Evaluative agency, which is judgments about alternatives, we've labelled ethical agency. And iterational agency, which is the reactivation of past patterns, we've labelled habitual agency here. Now, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take those three forms of agency in this triangle here, and I'm just going to twist them slightly in a different visual representation here, just to kind of set up. Unfortunately, I don't have time to go through all the arguments in the paper, but I want to try and kind of cut to the chase quite quickly, I think. So taking those three forms of agency, that triangle, and just changing it slightly, I've come up with this diagram here. So in the context of organisation studies and how we organised for innovation, we were interested in what is termed the organisational capability. This concept, this construct of capability, is something that organisational scholars study. So the organisational capability to innovate responsibly, and through our kind of empirical research, we suggested that these things at the bottom here, high quality science, innovation collaborations, opportunity search, and stakeholder engagement, these were all aspects of the capability to innovate responsibly. But they're all concerned with this habitual agency, but it's one that's collectively held. The notion of capabilities is it's knowledge that's collectively held within the group. It's the way groups do things, and we saw some of it in that sort of strict division of labour. But then we were conscious, we were focusing with the STIR study on researchers themselves and their own capacities to act. And so we disentangled this into what we call strategic agency and ethical agency. With strategic agency, we were looking them to think about, what might they do in confronted by the situation in which they, this project situation in which they face, and with ethical agency, how they make judgments between alternative courses of action. And these are things that perhaps you will see are germane to an understanding, or an explanation rather, of what Bob did. Okay, so so it was in this one sense for an organisational studies scholar, it was a classic qualitative theory building inductive sort of analysis, thematic analysis we did. And through that thematic analysis, we identified a number of contextual categories of action and a number of conditions associated with those contextual categories. So these are, in effect, these are categories of decision point. And there were two in particular that seemed to emerge from the thematic analysis. One we labeled uncertainty of impact. This was the, what I mean by this is the manner in which the scientists dealt with the consequences of their experimental work. This is what we mean by uncertainty of impact. They conducted experiments, and they're experiments, so they don't know how that they're going to turn out because they're experiments. So there's some level of uncertainty quite naturally, but we're interested in the uncertainty of that exists on the impact. And there were two conditions associated with that we discerned. One where there was kind of low uncertainty, where they were pretty sure that they understood not exactly what was going to happen because it was an experiment, but because of their scientific knowledge, they know broadly what the findings were, the arena at least, the landscape in which the findings were going to be found. And then there was this other category, condition of uncertainty of impacts, which we labeled high, which was where there was something about the impact that was beyond their expertise. This is the arena of the industrial collaboration, where the results, the impact of the results of their experiments wasn't wholly known to them. It could only be fully known if we take in these other areas of work. So that was the first contextual category. The second contextual category we identified was the freedom to innovate, the freedom to act, to do innovation. And by this, we simply means that the degree to which they were unconstrained by external influences. And the two conditions here, that either narrow, they weren't constrained very much at all. Sorry, they were constrained, it was narrow. They were constrained by some of the consideration, or it was broad. They were free to do what they want. So our thematic analysis identified these contextual categories and these conditions. So what I'm trying to do is put together those the visual diagram that we had before and these contextual categories. And I come up with an image like this. Now I'm very conscious, because I learned this as part of the STIR study, talking with STS scholars. I'm not suggesting this is the world. What I'm suggesting, this is a gross simplification of the complexity. And one of the things that it taught me 13 years ago was to stay complex. And here I am simplifying. So all I'm trying to do with this diagram is to tease out some of the mechanisms that I think are within the complexity of the social processes going on. So I'm not suggesting this is the whole world. It's just a representation of the mechanisms, I think. So what we have is at the top, we have these changing aspirations, these macro, what we call the macro foundations. These are policy mandates for responsible innovation and how they are impinging upon these projects. So if we look at the first one, the first contextual category of uncertainty of impact, then we have these two conditions, low and high. So in conditions where it's low and the science, it's straightforward, we're in the realm of normal science. We're just the scientists doing science, they're doing the experimentation, they're trying to find interesting science things, and there's nobody else really concerned at this point. And what we also found through our thematic analysis was the importance of the professional identity of scientists, that sense of values, knowledge, beliefs, norms of behavior, skills that are shared within his community. And in this with this contextual category and condition, we find that the identity of the scientist is fairly stable. It's fairly homogeneous. They know what they're doing. They know how to act. If we move over to the realm of innovation projects where there are other people involved in the project other than the scientist in the lab, which we've called high, comes from uncertainty, where the uncertainty of impact is high. Or we move over to freedom to innovate. In conditions where their freedom to innovate is narrow, so this is where Bob was in his 12 weeks, I think, where there were certain norms of behavior in the innovation project, but they included his sure knowledge of what his contribution was, how he was to act. Here again, I think we felt the professional identity of scientists was fairly stable. It was in a different situation, one that he didn't find he wasn't completely comfortable with, but his identity was fairly stable and kind of homogenous. He knew how to act in this condition. However, if we move to a situation where the freedom to innovate is broad, where the shackles are taken off, as they were towards the end of the project, then how does he act as a scientist? Now, potentially, maybe more generally than Bob, if someone's conscious of other societal considerations, let's call them, other mandates for responsible innovation, what we argued in the paper was that the current professional identity of the scientist, it starts to become unstable. It doesn't help them. Their norms of behavior, the skills that they've got are not sufficient to enable them to act. That's what we argue in the paper. So just putting some of that into words. So in the scenario of low uncertainty of impact, then the routines, practices of science and the professional identity of scientists inform them what they're supposed to do. Because we're just talking about normal science there, I think. In that condition where it's a high uncertainty of impact, so innovation projects, and a fairly narrow range of interest, this is the switch to applied science that we get in the collaborative project. Here, what they're required to do is match their own identity to that of these external interests, the industrial scientists or the toxicologist. And it starts to become problematical because there's some co-responsibility. And this came out of the modulation exercise, I felt. Bob started to feel some co-responsibility, but he was constrained under the norms of the interaction with the industrial company. And then in the final category, the high uncertainty of impact and the broad range of impacts, which was suggested by the policy discourse. We're not saying for definite, we don't make the claim that we saw this in the empirics. Here, there are identity issues start to emerge, but we felt, or we write in the paper, it was kind of at the level of the body of science itself and not of scientists. The current norms of what it is to be a scientist were are maybe still sort of deficient or not immediately aligned with the mandates of responsible innovation. Okay, so that's where we were looking at the issue of professional identity. Let's go to agency. Look at our diagram again, agency, where we introduce now is these considerations of strategic agency and ethical agency, in particular their relationship. Then in that category where the uncertainty is low and the professional identity of the scientist gives a sure guide to what they need to do in normal science, then this strategic projective agency and this ethical evaluative agency are pretty much aligned. But in normal science, they know how they're supposed to be behaved. In the contextual category where there's a bit more, where we're looking at applied science, it's an innovation project, but they're constrained by the project norms, and their identity as a scientist is still helpful, but it starts becoming, with this requirement for co-responsibility, it starts becoming a bit less homogeneous. Then the need for judgment, some degree of judgment on how to act starts to become germane in the decisions they make about what they're going to do and how they evaluate what they're going to do. And then potentially the final one, the more interesting one, was when the shackles are off and they can decide what they're going to do, and their identity is no sure guide, their professional identity as scientists is no sure guide on how to act. Then they have to engage in this thing that we labelled after McIntyre, a kind of virtuous quest, which is the quest to develop new practices of how to act as a scientist contributing to this innovation project. So again, putting that into some sort of words, with the low uncertainty of impact of normal science experimentation, strategic agency and ethical agency are aligned with their professional identity. When we're looking at applied science, then we argue that the ethical agency was, so this is high uncertainty of impact and narrow range of interest, that ethical agency is still indistinct from strategic agency. However, their identity is starting to change to a degree because they're being called upon to exercise judgment as a guide to how they act, how they developed the capability to participate in these projects. And then the interesting one, particularly in Bob's case, when the freedom to innovate is high and a broad range of considerations become apparent because of the midstream modulation exercises, I would want to argue, then there's some sort of contestation of innovation norms start to happen. This professional identity of, as a scientist, his experience over 14 years of doing these sort of projects are no longer a reliable source of how he should react in a way that is strategic and ethical. And in the paper, we discuss some of McIntyre's virtue ethics and speculate on how that restriction may be overcome. So let me put that into a kind of summary diagram. So repeat the diagram here, and I've just circled in red where I think we might read kind of Bob's decision that I introduced in the first part. So there's certainly an uncertainty of impact in the sense that he doesn't, because he's in this project, he does not know how the impact of his particular work is going to be, because there are other partners in this project. He's not totally in control of, or he doesn't have a complete understanding, rather, of what that involves. And after the project was cancelled and he was given the freedom to do what he wants, then he's no longer constrained by these institutional norms of industry, university, project collaboration. And he can literally do what he wants. In his own words, he becomes master of his own labs, kind of echoing Isaiah Berlin, actually. He used that phrase, been a master in the lab. And we heard what he did. But he's in this territory here, but his experience is no guide to what he did. He's not been, in his 14 years of projects, in a situation like this before. He doesn't have knowledge of what the toxicology group was doing or what home care company was doing. He has no knowledge, he's admitted that, of what the societal concerns are with dishwasher tablets. So there's no sure guide for him based on his experience and his skills and his values of what to do. And he clearly decided to do something. So we speculating in the paper about a virtue ethics and the pursuit of new practices. I'm suggesting in this slide that the midstream modulation exercises and the critical reflexivity that Bob displayed across the 14 weeks can be read as a quest to develop new practices of science and innovation. And it doesn't prove it in any kind of positivistic sense, but it is certainly consistent with his decision to study the dry phase, and when he did all those other projects, is certainly consistent with learning these new practices of midstream modulation and the capacity for greater reflexivity. So I'm sorry, I know I've whizzed through that really quite quickly. Hopefully I've done enough to make you interested in reading the original paper, but what I'm suggesting here is my reading of Bob's decision and why he came to why he did what he did. And just to finish off with the usual sort of thank yous, I want to thank Eric not only for the invitation today, but for everything I learned in those 4 years of the STIR study. And as in my introduction, as I explained, I'm still carrying STIR with me, even if I'm not actively researching responsible innovation. I must acknowledge Christo, who was my supervisor, and some of the STIRers for all the enjoyable conversations we had in the first cohort of STIRers in that 2019, 2013 cohort. And thank you for listening to me this morning as well.
Well, thank you, Paul, for that fabulous presentation, this great seminar. Really, really enjoyed how you elucidated the case that you presented based on this very nice framework, and it brings up a number of issues. We only have 10 minutes, 11 minutes to discuss, but I want to get into some of them, or at least flag some of them for continued thinking. And so I'll just throw out a couple ideas, but I see Marika's got her hand raised, so maybe I'll hold my ideas and we'll go to Marika.
Yeah, thank you again. This definitely made me curious to read the research policy paper. And I have a question on the notion of organizational capabilities and their relation to capacities, because in STIR we talk about capacities. And if I understand this correctly, also in organizational studies, you say that a capacity is of an individual human being, while capabilities refer to organizations or groups. And I'm wondering how in organizational studies or in your work, the two are related. So are organizational capabilities more than the sum of human capacities, or are they the sum, so to say, or how is that conceptualized?
Yeah, so this is actually a very good theoretical question for organizational studies, and one that is not resolved. So a lot of people have tried to study the micro foundations of these capabilities, and what they invariably go to is a set of individual capacities. So they document what and study what those might be, and they study the capabilities at an organizational level. And the reasonable assumption is made that the organizational ones are built from the individual ones, but the mechanisms by which they aggregate is an ongoing, that's just contested as to what that might be, how these things. It's particularly important, I think, is an important consideration when we consider things like responsible innovation, some things new. How does a group develop a new organizational capability? If they are just born of or grow from the individual ones, okay, then that's kind of suggests that the individuals have to have this capacity for responsible innovation in this case at first. But that's by no means clear. So that whole relationship and the aggregation of individual capacities to organizational capabilities is contested, actually. To the extent that almost people have stopped trying to theorize it, because it's not clear at all. I mean, it's interesting to understand what individual capacities are and organizational capabilities are, because that's interesting and that's amenable to study. But the relationship is still it's just not settled.
It's also not helped by the capabilities, intellectual movement that has moved into development and human empowerment, which is a very strong and very beautiful discourse, and it also originates in philosophy, that Martha Nussbaum, because that sort of flips the language. So I think, I think what's important for us is and that's where maybe strategic and ethical agency are more helpful, or the macro foundations versus micro foundations, right? But that's one of the nice things about Paul's work, is that it brings this kind of the perennial structure agency tensions. It brings them productively into productive alignment, and you're drawing on both more sociological as well as more philosophical concepts. So there's kind of maybe two realms of, I think, topics that are interesting for discussion here, but I'd really like to hear, even if people don't have formulated questions, just, what are some of the, what are some of the themes or topics or questions that might be worth unpacking offline, right? So Puga, if you have any, critiques or insights, they don't have to be fully formed. I'd just love to get them on, get them out here. But sort of two areas of inquiry are, first of all, maybe this can really help us, I think, understand what responsible innovation is, where it applies, how it's different from more settled understandings of ethical rules and norms and conduct. So I think it pushes into the right side of the diagram when there is recognize. I think this is a key, this is where reflexivity comes in, right? Because a good STSer may argue that there's always going to be uncertainty and impact and freedom, like these dimensions don't necessarily change over time for the analyst. But what's great about our position is that we study the sort of the awareness of the actor. So what changes over time? Well, it may just be the actor's reflexive awareness that I have a lot of freedom to innovate. I have a lot of uncertainty of impact, right? So however you get there, right? It's not necessarily an ontological claim, right? It may be more of a claim of situated awareness, but in any case, when you move to that right-hand side, then the standard rules of operation don't apply, whether they're ethical or cultural or institutional, right? And, this is radical design. Vincenti talked about, there's different versions of it, but it's when you're here, this is where the process becomes important, the process dimensions of responsible innovation that still go published on in the same issue that Paul's paper came out, and where the McIntyre or other forms of virtue might appear. So I wanted to flag that, and the other topic is how to interpret your case, but let's go to Puga.
So thank you very much, Paul, for your presentation. It was amazing. I really like the word agency, because it's something that I'm actually studying, and it's amazingly interesting. And you cannot have ethical concerns without agency, right? Because as Kant used to say, ought implies can. You need to do it. You need to be able to do it in order to be an ethical mandate that requires you to do it, right? Yep. So if I was thinking on your diagram here, there are two things that are constraining agency, right? There's the impact of the research, and then there's the freedom of the patrons that are allowing this research. But I think there's a third thing that is always constraining agency, and that's something internal to the person that it's executing agency. And that is, and critical reflexivity is one, and the capabilities that go with it. So and I wonder if well, this thing is this is another constraint. So for example, now that I'm studying personal autonomy, people that say that people that have impoverished childhood cannot have the same ethical mandates as other people that have other kinds of childhood, right? Because they cannot act in the same way. So in this sense, scientists that have some sort of impoverished training in critical reflexivity regarding ethical issues, that would also be something that constrains agency from the inside, and that is not visible at all, or that it's not visible prima facie, at least. So I wonder if with this comment you would be able to incorporate, how would you incorporate this third constraint on agency, which is inside of the person, into your diagram? Where would it go?
Oh, I would probably need to think about that a bit. Yes, I'm not sure where I would incorporate it in my diagram. As I was listening to you, the thoughts that I was having that were prompted were around the training of scientists. So accepting that people's background is in a sense people's background, there's things we can do in terms of their training as scientists. And what I find is, in my experience, that still 12 years later, although responsible innovation is part of what certainly the scientists I deal with I've kind of covered, because the research funders require it. But it's a very instrumental understanding of it it's difficult to distinguish it from risk assessment, just, you know, that somebody would do in any case for like in case of chemistry, that would do, you know, for handling the materials. So I think there is something that we can do about this very personal form of capacity to act that's allied to the way we train scientists, I think. But it's not in the form of like conventional training programs. I mean, it would be very interesting to catch up with Bob after a decade and understand what sort of work he's doing, and to whether to any extent any of this stuck. I mean, he was quite a reflective person, which is probably why the conversations kind of went so well. But I think there is, I said, just to recap, the thought that occurs to me is that we need to do more, or we need to do differently in the way we train scientists if we want to build this sort of capacity to this sort of more internal capacity to act in ways that are strategic and ways that are ethical, I think.
Good. Yes, I think this remains true. 220, 200, or 2,000 years later, depending on where you start this conversation, it is an ongoing challenge. We're at the 10 o'clock mark here in Arizona, but I want to give Shivam at least a chance to ask his question. And Paul, if you want, you can answer if there's time.
Yes, yeah.
Hey, Paul, thank you for your presentation. It was really insightful. I'm using some of the things that you're talking about, especially when you're talking about agency. And one of the things I was going to ask you about was, how do you see the impact of STIR on habitual agency specifically, of all the agencies you listed? Did it change it? Did it evolve it? How was habitual agency of the participant, the STIR participant, changed after your interaction with them?
I'm not sure, actually, because I did not continue. I went back a few times with Bob. I don't know to what extent some of the things that I think he displayed in this decision continued. I did bump, because we were at the same university for a while, I did bump into him in the street front of campus from time to time, but it was more an everyday conversation rather than anything else. So I'm not sure to what extent this became iterative, in Emma Beer and Misha's phrase. I'm not certain at all. It's, in a sense, it speaks to that notion of how do you change what is an interaction with an individual, and they're building their individual capacity with something that gets sedimented in the organizational level routine and capability. I think it's that, I mean, the processes of institutionalization that we're looking at in in the research policy paper, we were interested in this organizational level of analysis, but it as I mentioned earlier, it becomes unclear how we go from the individual to the organizational. It's kind of in organizational studies, these processes of institutionalization are the ones that I invoke to explain how particular capacities become embedded and secure in any particular situation. So it's, in a sense, it's that transition from the individual acquiring some habitual agency to is the research group requiring habitual agency. And one of the difficulties we're going to encounter there is the turnover of scientists in these, in these groups. So I don't have an answer, but something becoming embedded and something becoming habitual, we do have to consider the organizational level as level capacity as well as the individual level capacity.
Okay, yeah, that's that is totally fair. I was just saying what your thoughts on that were. Thanks for answering that.
Great question, Shivam. Great response, Paul. And, I'll just sort of mark that there's two ways, at least, I mean, there's numerous, but I can think of distinguishing two ways in which iterative agency or lasting effects can be conceptualized. One is in sort of a new type of behavior or a new routine, right? Which one might call ethical or responsible or even virtue ethical. But there's also a more subtle, and these aren't always distinguished, but it's good to entangle them. There's more of a subtle, I think this gets into the notion of capacity, what we're searching for, the capacity to recognize when you're in this high uncertainty, high freedom moment, right? Or when your agency is divorced from the strategic, institutionalized rules. Right. And so this is not necessarily the same thing as, now we stop and ask questions routinely. Now we do an extra check beforehand. Now we say, is this socially relevant? Right. They go hand in hand. They can each support the other. But I think this latter one is a little more subtle and perhaps more vital. Maybe it's more of a micro foundation than its application, or sort of unthinking, now I've got tacit, I just do this automatically. That's one distinction I want to make. The second one is your really salient point about transfer and turnover. But what is sort of problematic can also become a new form of maybe capability, and that is that individuals, right? So organizations change, right? There's a problem of organizational memory, institutionalizing responsible innovation in groups, in organizations, right? But when these individuals move, they also potentially take their skills and capabilities with them, right? So this is also something to track, and the moves can be lateral, they can be hierarchical, right? Somebody can become a manager and then influence the culture of the lab she's leading, for instance. So I just wanted to point to that other side. So two distinctions, but we'll give Paul the last word. He's already had his last word, but if you had any final reflections on any of this, and of course, we'll continue the conversation.
Just thank you for the opportunity to kind of reconnect myself to this work, because it speaks to that project with the robot. Is one where that particular lab, that particular situation is one where I'm trying to negotiate a responsible innovation study. And so it's been good to reconnect. So thank you for the opportunity.
Well, thank you, Paul. Okay, everyone. We'll see you next month, if not next week. All the best.
Thank
Paul,
you.
you want to stay on for a minute? You and I can
sure.
just. Yeah.